In 1965, as the civil rights struggle escalated, Black Americans were in the streets fighting for justice and equality. They were being attacked and killed. But a different kind of violence was taking thousands of Black lives every year. Segregated medical care was a brutal reality for Black Americans.
Negroes had one ward. If you were dying from cancer, if you were there to have a baby or whatever, you're on the same ward.
Everything was segregated. Not just the hospitals, but physicians' practices. I was the only Black pediatrician in the entire state.
People were dying as a result of that segregated system.
The 1964 Civil Rights Act tied federal funds to desegregation. Now Medicare, with its promise of federal funds, created an opportunity to end the shocking inequalities in medical care. This is the remarkable story of how civil rights activists and the federal government, working together, desegregated thousands of hospitals practically overnight, bringing life-saving care to millions of Americans. This little-known story reveals the role of countless people who never took center stage, but whose shoulders we stand on.
Power to Heal, Medicare and the Civil Rights Revolution was made possible with the help of funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, exploring the human endeavor. From the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, dedicated to strengthening America's future through education. From the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation President's Grant Fund of the Princeton Area Community Foundation. From City University of New York. And from Hunter College, the Samuel Rubin Foundation and the Yip Harburg Foundation.
For most of America's history, a system of racial segregation dictated every aspect of life. In no area was this more true than in healthcare.
You think about the civil rights movement, you think about housing, public accommodation, education. But I think the story hasn't been told often about what happened in terms of the institutions of medicine. So that's an unrevealed part of the history.
When I was 2 years old, I almost died of whooping cough. Being admitted to the hospital was not even an issue. Hospitals were segregated, as were most hospitals in the South.
I couldn't lift my head, and I couldn't sit up. My uncle came and picked me up. He took me to the hospital. And the hospital said, we don't know what this is, but we're not going to take a Black child that we don't know what it is.
Living was separate and unequal. So that made some individuals and communities sicker than others in the first place. But then once you got sicker, then access to the healthcare system was also unequal.
Black activist doctors such as Dorothy Farabee created health outreach programs that served thousands of Black Americans in the South before World War II. Shut out of white hospitals, Black doctors founded their own hospitals, but limited resources and a hostile government crippled their efforts. Lacking access to mainstream medicine, people in rural communities resorted to home remedies passed down through the African American community for generations.
Only access to health care had been what your parents or grandparents or other people on the plantation knew about things that grew and that they had access to.
In the mid-1960s, while poor people of all races had little access to medical care, segregation made access even worse for people of color.
They didn't have to go to Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia. We had a third world, including a third world for healthcare in Mississippi. People who lacked food and clothing and shelter, no protected water supplies, having to haul clean water from 5 or 10 miles away, disease, malnutrition, suffering, and their combinations were rampant.
This was a population that had no medical care practically, and many who had never seen a physician before in their life. Women who had 8 children but had never seen a physician.
The system was a feudal system. You would get permission from the person that owned the plantation, and they would give you a note that you could go to the doctor.
A lot of hypertension And people assumed it was a birthright. My mama had it. So they just sort of waited for it to attack and waited to have the strokes and everything.
These were reasons that life expectancy was so short for blacks in Mississippi, that infant mortality was so high.
In both the North and South, black babies died at twice the rate of white babies.
30 to 40% of live births was at home, sometimes not only at homes, but in the cotton field.
We didn't have a nursery, and we just took drawers out of cabinets and put babies in them, you know, and we could put those right by the mother's bed so that we didn't lose any babies or anything.
There was just a little broom closet where they would stick a bassinet, and you had to go and check on your own baby.
They would tell fathers of newborns that they couldn't have their wife and baby back until they paid a certain amount of money.
It was a $125 bill, and I said, I don't have $125. And the lady said, well, we'll just have to keep the baby. And I thought, that's excellent. I'll come and visit him every day. He's going to get fed and taken care of.
In our town, we could not use the hospital. It's called Parkview Hospital. Well, her final pregnancy, my mom was going to need a C-section. The baby was big. Dad went to the administrator at the hospital to say, could she please be delivered there? And they refused. She went into labor. They couldn't get her to the colored ward, so they delivered her at home. And my brother, I'm gonna have a hard time with this. My brother sustained a stroke because of it. That moment is why I'm a physician. It also was the defining moment for me about what disparities really were.
Disparities between black and white Americans were legally validated by an 1896 Supreme Court ruling that segregation was constitutional as long as the races were kept separate but equal, and they were separate but never equal.
Everything was black and white. There was a black section and a white section. Cafeterias, the hospital waiting area, the rooms, the beds, and everything were in separate parts of the hospital.
Everything was inferior on the black side, from equipment to the blankets to the room to the painting. It was just clear.
Everyone was on one floor, no matter what you had, a baby, TV, or whatever.
Every time you went into a hospital that was segregated, it was saying to you that your life as a black person is not worth as much as a white life. You didn't give them titles like Mr. or Mrs. or Miss or anything.
The white patients were Mrs. and the black patients were Perline, Sally, or Sue, whatever.
They used boy for black men. No matter how old they were, you were a boy.
They never got grown. They were just always a child to somebody that was white.
I learned in a difficult way that it applied to me too. One time, 2 state troopers drove up, stopped their car, and jumped out and came over to me. They said, "What's your name, boy?" And I said, "Dr. Poussin." And they just looked at me. And they said, "What's your name, boy?" And I said, "Dr. Poussin." And they said, "What's your first name, boy?" And at that point, one of the policemen put his hand on his gun. My secretary was trembling, and she yanked my arm. She knew the system, and she felt that the next step was that they were going to hit me. And she was probably right. And so I told him, "Alvin." He said, "Good." He said, "Next time you give us a hard time, you're coming down to the station house."
Yazoo City at that time was totally segregated. And one of my jobs as a young person was to answer the back door, which is where the colored office was. There would be someone who was so wounded, they would have to go to a hospital. So they would have to go to Jackson, which was 50 miles away. People routinely died on the trip to Jackson. because there was no hospital in Yazoo City that would take blacks.
Segregation made it difficult even to get to the hospital. White-operated ambulances would not pick up black patients.
They had to use hearses. Hearses that were not in use were used as ambulances, and many black doctors reflected on the bitter irony of this because as the hearse plied from town to town like a Flying Dutchman, looking for a hospital, someone who would treat this patient, the patient often died in the back seat of the hearse. Many people assume that segregation was a phenomenon of the South, but it actually wasn't. It was very extended throughout the North as well.
Wherever you looked, you could see the reality of segregation, but there were no signs. Most hospitals in Chicago weren't admitting black patients at all. A few did admit some black patients, usually some segregated part of the hospital, never put in a double room with a white patient.
Emergency rooms would not admit black people if their quotas were filled, and therefore they were sent to county hospital with a note, no beds.
Even the wealthiest black patient had to go into the charity ward.
You could have $1,000 bills coming out of your ears. But if the 10% quota at the University of Chicago was filled, you went to county hospital. It was a mob.
If you had no money, couldn't pay, you went to the clinic, you sat there all day. Women with children and babies and crying and hot and all of that.
People were waiting and waiting and waiting. One night I had 20 admissions and 4 deaths of people I had not seen.
For 3 decades, U.S. presidents had tried to expand access to health care.
We have accepted, so to speak, a second Bill of Rights, the right to adequate medical care, regardless of race or creed.
Roosevelt didn't put health care in the Social Security bill because he thought it could never pass. Truman tried to do it.
I've repeatedly asked the Congress to pass a health program. The nation suffers from lack of medical care.
And was just clobbered by the American Medical Association.
The American Medical Association, or the AMA, attacked Truman's health care proposal as socialized medicine. Black doctors and the NAACP supported it. Truman's proposal failed. Instead, Congress passed the 1946 Hill-Burton Act, which provided for the construction and renovation of hospitals throughout the country.
It was a really large financial package that was going to transform the facilities of American hospitals. To get it through the Congress, the legislative process had to deal with the Southerners, and they insisted on a separate but equal clause that would permit segregation in hospital facilities.
What it said was, go ahead, keep your segregated hospitals in the South, and the federal government will support you and subsidize the expansion of Jim Crow.
Hill-Burton was the only piece of federal legislation passed in the 20th century that had separate but equal written into it.
Best characterized by Grady Hospital, the big public hospital in Atlanta, with one tower for whites and another tower for people of color.
The hospital was built like an H. The 2 front wings, the A and the B wings, were the white wings. The 2 in the back, the C and the D wings, were the colored wings. Everything was duplicated. There were 2 separate blood banks because it was a criminal offense to cross-transfuse blood.
Segregation also made it difficult for blacks to get training to become doctors and nurses, and once trained, to practice.
I came to Grady segregated. I went through Grady segregated. If I saw the class of 1964 white, I wouldn't recognize any of them. We didn't take any classes together.
We entered on one side of the hospital, and I cannot tell you which door the black students entered, but they didn't enter with us. We were not allowed to go to each other's dormitory. I'm afraid that I really didn't get to know any of the black class. The white students had a blue dress.
This is the white student, her uniform, what you see is blue and white, and this is the black student.
Southern states were determined to maintain segregation. They barred black students from attending state medical schools, but paid their out-of-state tuition in exchange for returning home to practice. Many northern schools also refused to admit black students.
I was required to send a picture to Johns Hopkins. I had very good references from significant academic members of the Harvard community. But within 2 weeks, I got a rejection. And my conclusion was they saw my picture.
About 85% of all black physicians were educated at only 2 schools, Howard and Meharry. Faculty and students at these schools became the hub of medical civil rights activism. After graduation, it was very difficult for black doctors to get specialized residency training.
Most blacks, if they went into a residency, had to train in an all-black hospital such as Harlem or Providence in Chicago, Mercy Douglas, Philadelphia.
Black doctors could not get hospital privileges once they finished their training because they were barred from their local medical society. As a result, they could not admit their patients to the hospital or treat them there. These county medical societies were affiliates of the AMA, which refused to end these discriminatory practices.
American Medical Association had never been a friend of ours.
If you did not belong to the county medical society, you were denied admission. That was the first step of stopping you.
Some of the young docs now, they can't believe. You mean to tell me you couldn't admit your patients to the hospital? You know? No, couldn't.
Barred from the AMA and refused admitting privileges, black doctors had to find sympathetic white doctors to admit their patients. Many carried a hospital in their black bags, delivering babies at home and performing surgery on kitchen tables. They continued to fight these injustices, forming their own medical society, the National Medical Association, or the NMA, to advocate for themselves and their patients.
A hospital is the workplace of doctors. Who determines who's going to be on the medical staff is the doctors themselves. All the doctors in these hospitals were white. They were admitting white patients, so that if you wanted to charge them with segregation, the doctors would say, well, we're practicing in this neighborhood, we serve our patients are white, this is our hospital. That's the essence of what you mean by institutional racism, right? It isn't something that you can pinpoint in terms of an action. It's built into the structure.
Having fought for their country in World War II, returning black veterans grew increasingly active in opposing segregation back home.
For many of us who've gone overseas, fought for this country, fought for Mississippi, we fought for Alabama, we fought for North Carolina, we fought for Illinois, we fought for every state in this union.
In the Army, Negroes were in separate barracks. They had separate places to eat. We began to realize, what do we fight for? I think it all really begun when we came back and saw how we'd been mistreated. We couldn't register, we couldn't vote, we couldn't serve on any of the jurors because we were Negroes. And that was unfair. That's when we got active.
Civil rights activists scored their first major victory against separate but equal in 1954. With Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated education was unconstitutional. A crack was opening for the end of separate but equal. Black doctors were on the front lines fighting to desegregate beaches, lunch counters, schools, and hospitals. The National Medical Association joined the fight for integrated health care, and leading the charge was Dr. Montague Cobb.
He was editor of the National Medical Association Journal. He was very involved in trying to identify and change access problems to education, scholarships for education, privileges at hospitals.
Working with the National Medical Association, Dr. Cobb invited the AMA and other white medical practitioners to an annual meeting on hospital integration. The goal was to develop a joint strategy to desegregate the hospitals, but the AMA never sent an official representative. The NMA, joined by Bob Smith and John Holloman, leaders of the newly formed Medical Committee for Civil Rights, challenged the AMA at their 1963 National Convention.
I accepted the role to go to Atlantic City and do something that no other physicians had done of record. That was the first time a group of physicians had taken direct action against AMA, demanding that they come out unequivocally against segregation and discrimination, and that the federal government would put some kind of enforcement clause into Hill-Burton hospitals. That was the beginning of some real pressure on the AMA.
Less than a week later, Dr. Smith attended a civil rights meeting organized by Medgar Evers, NAACP Field Secretary for Mississippi. When Evers arrived home, he was shot dead in his driveway.
We were just all personally devastated and wanted to do something. So I started to provide medical care to civil rights workers. I've been involved in some type of activity such as this ever since.
That summer, civil rights movement actions intensified, drawing public attention to the brutal realities of Southern segregation. The movement was met with increasing violence, all televised on the nightly news. On August 28th, several hundred members of the Medical Committee for Civil Rights joined more than 250,000 people in the March on Washington to demand justice. It was the biggest demonstration the country had ever seen.
The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
Hospital desegregation was gaining more visibility, but the breakthrough they had all been fighting for was led by a dentist in North Carolina.
One civil rights activist, a dentist named George Simpkins, contacted the Legal Defense Fund. It was not the first time. He'd been put in jail for trying to integrate a golf course. And he was a local gadfly, and he was a courageous man. And he said, I want to bring a lawsuit to get staff privileges at the white hospitals in Greensboro.
Dr. George Simpkins was the president of the Greensboro NAACP.
Patient came in my office and he had a temperature of 103 and his jaw was swollen. I said, this boy needs to be in the hospital. So I called the black hospital, L. Richardson Hospital. They just didn't have any beds available. And I called Cone and Wesley Long. They had beds, but they would not accept him because of his race.
In the South, almost all of the cases, either against hospitals or schools, were brought by dentists. They were totally independent and therefore had a degree of freedom that even the black physicians in these communities did not have.
Both hospitals had been built with Hill-Burton funds. We proceeded to attack them at that point on the grounds that they had been built with Hill-Burton funds.
This was a chance to challenge the constitutionality of the separate but equal clause of Hill-Burton. Simpkins and a group of black doctors sued the hospitals. They lost in district court. It was a bitter defeat.
We lost it in Middle District. Then we appealed it to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals.
When you challenge the constitutionality of a federal statute, you notify the government.
Robert Kennedy saw that notice, and all kinds of bells and whistles went off for him. Because here he could enter into this decision as a friend, not of the defendants, but of the plaintiffs. That was almost unprecedented, even a surprise from the part of Legal Defense Fund. They hadn't expected to have the weight of the executive branch on their side.
By throwing the full support of the Justice Department behind the plaintiffs in the Simpkins case, Attorney General Robert Kennedy reversed 100 years of federal collaboration with Jim Crow.
Discrimination must stop, not only because it is legally insupportable, economically wasteful, and socially destructive, but above all because it is morally wrong.
President Kennedy sent a telegram to Dr. Cobb confirming that he was finally joining the fight to end hospital segregation. On the 1st of November, 1963, the appeals court ruled in Simpkins' favor. The separate but equal provision of Hill-Burton was declared unconstitutional. It was a huge victory, But the only way to enforce it would be to sue every segregated hospital in the country. New legislation was needed. President Kennedy proposed the Civil Rights Act, which, using language from the Simpkins decision, forbid discrimination in any entity receiving federal funds.
Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it is not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
The prospect for moving civil rights forward looked promising. Less than a month after the Simpkins case was decided, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Two of President Kennedy's goals were left unfinished: the Civil Rights Act and the Medical Care for the Aged, or Medicare. As Americans mourned the loss of President Kennedy, the country did not know if their new Southern president would pick up the mantle. Without presidential support, civil rights activists feared that progress towards equality and access to health care would be halted.
Let us carry forward the plans and programs of John Fitzgerald Kennedy with the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long.
I think one of the great tributes that we can pay in memory of President Kennedy is to try to enact some of the great progressive policies that he sought to initiate. Well, I'm going to support them all, and you can count on that, and I'm going to do my best to get other men to do likewise, and I'll have to have y'all's help. I never needed more than I do now.
Dr. King was able to talk rationally, soundly, sanely, and effectively with President Johnson. And President Johnson understood, and certainly he was in concert with Dr. King.
No president, including Lincoln, did more on civil rights than LBJ.
It is time now to write the next chapter and to write it in the books of law.
President Johnson and the civil rights movement fought for the passage of the Civil Rights Bill. They faced fierce opposition.
It is a very drastic bill. If it's enacted into law, it will, in effect, change our system of government.
It's unnecessary, it's unwise, and unconstitutional.
Every significant committee and subcommittee was chaired by a senator or congressman from the South. They had achieved those seats of power by virtue of seniority. They were elected again and again and again. Congress is, in fact, a bastion of Southern senators and congressmen.
I see no room for compromise in this bill. We're preparing for battle to the death.
The bill came to the floor of the Senate on March 30th, 1964, and the Southern Democrats proceeded to filibuster it for 57 days. President Johnson needed Minority Leader Everett Dirksen to get Republican support to break the filibuster, and he asked civil rights leaders for help.
They say I'm an arm twister, but I can't make a Southerner change his spots any more than I can make a leopard change them. If we lose this fight, Roy, we're going back 10 years. You're going to have to persuade Dirksen.
I'm going to be on this bill, Mr. President. We know that the work has got to be done here with us.
Who are you going to take? You going to take all your Republicans? Give me one or two of them. Well, you got enough votes to be. No, I haven't. Now, you either for civil rights or you're not. You're either the party of Lincoln or you ain't.
He understands Dirksen well enough to say, this is one of my favorite LBJ lines, you know, Dirksen, you come with me on this bill, and 200 years from now, school children will know only two names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen.
He made a priority to have that civil rights bill that would end segregation in the South passed. If he had failed in that, his whole presidency would have failed. He would have never been elected in November.
I think in the long run, the real significance of the Civil Rights Act will be found in Title VI and the use of public funds.
Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act stated that if you were a recipient of federal funds as a hospital or any entity, you are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race.
Nobody believed that Title VI was going to work.
There was extensive, permanent, established, accepted patterns of discrimination and segregation.
There was no way to enforce it. There was no funding for investigators. There were no fines.
It was like the Supreme Court decision around
desegregating schools, where they said, with all deliberate speed, which means what? Go as slow as you want, take your good time doing it. You don't have to do it right away.
While Southern senators were filibustering the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Movement continued to mobilize across the country. 1,500 Northern volunteers headed down south, joining 60,000 Mississippians to register voters for Freedom Summer. The Medical Committee for Human Rights, as they were now called, recruited healthcare professionals to provide care and document police brutality and discrimination in healthcare.
When the call came in 1964 for the Mississippi Summer Project, I was afraid, but I made the decision to go and really solidify that decision, to die. And that's what we were asked to do, to make a decision to die. And if you couldn't make that decision, go home.
The danger was real and sometimes deadly.
James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner went to Mississippi to help register Negroes as voters. The three had last been seen heading southeast on Highway 19.
These young men have probably been killed in the state of Mississippi. They were murdered by a system of racial segregation, which over the years relegated persons to the status of things.
I went to Mississippi basically to do voter registration, but I got immediately involved in health activities because it became very apparent that there were really great health problems within the community and health needs.
When the MCHR hired me, they gave that as one of my duties, was to help get these hospitals and health facilities desegregated and look at the health issues and what we're going to do about them for this population and this change in social order. So we made that one of our priorities.
The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW, was not enforcing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act.
Nearly all the hospitals in Mississippi, after the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 was passed, were still segregated. So I called Washington, and they said, we haven't received any complaints. So I said, you mean, so we have to send in a complaint on every hospital before you will act or do something? And they said, that's right. We organized this whole mission to get complaints documenting that these facilities were still segregated and practicing discrimination, and sent hundreds of letters to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. You needed to complain and raise a ruckus to make the federal government move on these things.
These complaints, journalists got a hold of them, and they could point out that a particular hospital that had done something egregious was still considered in compliance, that HEW had not moved to force them to comply with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The next phase was to try and make sure that the federal government not only accepted non-discrimination in theory and in law, but required it in fact.
To respond to the complaints and desegregate the hospitals, HEW faced the impossible task of suing every hospital that failed to comply with Title VI. But a new law would present a different alternative.
The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice.
With the 1964 presidential election looming, President Johnson made the passage of Medicare a priority. This new legislation would provide an unexpected way to enforce civil rights in hospitals.
I am proposing that every person over 65 years of age be spared the darkness of sickness without hope.
These two major pieces of legislation giving health care access to the elderly and to the poor, they were opposed by the American Medical Association.
A new system of health care financing that is unwanted by many Americans, protested, and in my opinion, unnecessary.
The AMA, who still refused to require local and state societies to admit black physicians, remain unrelenting in their opposition to government-funded health insurance. They had previously rallied against President Kennedy's health care for the aged proposal.
Medical care for the aged bill was defeated in the United States Senate, a program which has been fought by the American Medical Association and successfully defeated.
Now the AMA doubled their efforts to raise a war chest and hired an actor named Ronald Reagan as their spokesman.
It's very easy to disguise a medical program as a humanitarian project. If this program will pass, behind it will come other federal programs that will invade every area of freedom as we have known it in this country.
Dr. Montague Cobb, now president of the National Medical Association, testified in favor of the bill.
The National Medical Association supported. First time a president had ever been to a meeting of the National Medical Association to speak, it was when he came to thank them for their support.
As voters went to the polls, sides were clearly drawn.
There's a lot of our older people that are perfectly capable of handling their own financing and are doing so.
Because it does nothing at all for the older person or any person who becomes ill and can't handle their own bills.
President Johnson wants a program of hospital insurance for older Americans. He is determined to see this program passed in the next Congress. Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
President Johnson used his overwhelming victory in the 1964 election to ensure that the House Ways and Means Committee support Medicare. No other health insurance bill had ever made it out of this powerful committee.
I think the committee has done this in a way that will make a contribution to improved possibilities of medical care in all areas and without any socialization of any profession involved.
And I'm so hopeful that we will finally be successful in this Congress in providing comprehensive hospital and medical insurance for our senior citizens.
The American Medical Association still indicated that they did not think doctors should take part in Medicare.
How much money would you estimate the AMA has spent over the past few years fighting Medicare?
I would have to only guess that it's several $1 million.
So the president invites the AMA to the White House in the cabinet room, puts the president of the AMA to his right. He says, I have this terrible war in Vietnam. I have the doctors in the military, but I need doctors to help take care of the civilian population. I want you to start a program. Your president and your country really need you. Will you do it? And the head of the AMA said, of course, Mr. President, we will do it. We will do it. Call in the press, Johnson says, right away. Press comes in. LBJ announces the program. The first question from the reporters is, will the AMA support Medicare? Will the doctors support Medicare? And the president looks surprised at the question, puts his hand over the arm of the head of the AMA, and he says, these men are willing to put their lives on the line for this country. Of course they'll support it. Doctor? The doctor said, yes, Mr. President, we're with you.
President and Mrs. Johnson and Vice President Humphrey arrive for ceremonies that will make the Medicare bill a part of Social Security coverage. The Harry S. Truman Library at Independence, Missouri, is the scene of an historic event. Mr. Johnson chose to sign the bill here as a tribute to former President Truman.
But we wanted you to know, and we wanted the entire world to know, that we haven't forgotten who is the real daddy of Medicare.
The only representative of the medical profession invited to the signing of Medicare was Dr. Montague Cobb. He flew on Air Force One with the president. No representative from the AMA was invited. The president brought in John Gardner to head the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare.
You had a huge program that was going to involve millions of elderly people in thousands of facilities and tens of thousands of physicians that had to be implemented within a year.
19 million Americans have enrolled so far in the Great Society's Medicare program.
25% of the revenues of hospitals would be coming as a result of the Medicare program. How could the federal government begin the Medicare program and give federal funds to already discriminatory hospitals?
The federal government was moving very slowly. They talked there, we're doing the best we can. We're going to get things together. We're going to find more investigators. I would say, well, that's good. And when are you going to show us something?
Black doctors were angered by the lack of progress and demanded a meeting with Secretary Gardner.
The NAACP blasts HEW for the inadequate enforcement of health law under Title VI.
HEW is guilty of a double cross. They have betrayed us and deceived us. Negroes have been exposed to a new enemy, HEW.
It was a grand piece of political showmanship. The press came, they told them they were going to miss a golden opportunity if they had failed to desegregate the hospitals.
In response, Gardner created the Office of Civil Rights and hired Peter Labasi, turning all of HEW into a civil rights enforcement agency.
This is Pete Labasi, my special assistant for civil rights.
The wire service went out, and it went out all over the country. Not the most important federal job in the world, but civil rights was the most important issue in the world. This Office for Civil Rights at HEW, which didn't exist until January of '66, had the talented people that were there, the people who had lived through the civil rights issues, working for the NAACP, working in local communities.
Sherry Arnstein, who'd been a young staff assistant, had been involved in desegregating a hospital in Virginia, said, for Medicare, don't do what you did with education, which was incremental. She said, you have to do it all or none. They have to be desegregated or you don't get any money.
That they could, at that point, grasp that you gotta get this civil rights into the administrative process. You can't do it court by court, district by district. Then, if you didn't like the decision denying you federal funds, you had to go to court. And you had to pay for the lawyers. And you had to bring the action against the government, instead of the government always being the one who was suing to desegregate. So it reversed the roles as to who goes to court.
And that changed the game. This was a national program of great importance. Suddenly, the healthcare facilities realized that they better get their act together if they wanted to receive funds under Medicare.
What civil rights activists had begun to discover is what we call the golden rule. Those that have the gold rule.
With only 3 months left, Gardner and Labasi faced an impending disaster. Less than half of the hospital beds in the country were desegregated. In the South, few hospitals were desegregated.
And that really freaked everybody out. And the pressure was really on.
All that is required is this. 1, admit Negro doctors to staffs in numbers sufficient to make a difference. 2, admit Negro patients on more than a token basis.
John Gardner was very strong on using the Civil Rights Act to desegregate Medicare. We had a meeting in John's office, and he made it very clear to us that we were not proceeding quickly enough. There were 7,000 hospitals. They could clear about 5,000 of them. 2,000 hospitals needed to be actually visited.
With just 2 months left before the implementation of Medicare, northern hospitals were integrating, but only 27% of southern hospitals and only 4% of Mississippi hospitals were desegregated. Secretary Gardner needed a team to inspect the hospitals resisting compliance. He sent out a call to every office in HEW asking for a staff to work as inspectors. More than 700 people responded and joined this passionate bureaucratic army. The recruits included laboratory scientists, veterinarians, nurses, pharmacists, and managers of Social Security field offices. Few had any faintly relevant experience.
People had to volunteer to be on the front edge of what seemed to be an impossible task. They would be putting in hundreds of hours a week. There would be sleepless nights. There would be threats, police departments that tried to harass them. They would deal with Klan members that would chase them. So the volunteers that they got were not typical civil servants. They were a group of really impassioned activists.
My generation hated the government. We hated the war in Vietnam. To finally meet a group of people who were working for the federal government and who were part of an office to desegregate, it made me very proud to have that ID card that said federal government.
They had the orientation for these investigators at Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia.
Phyllis Cunningham, Jack Garg, and I attended to orient the workers. with regard to getting these facilities desegregated.
And they arranged for intensive training of the doctors and the Social Security administrative staff and the civil rights staff on what is it to desegregate a hospital.
So when we came in, we were clearly very well informed.
So this was not the AMA. This was not the American Hospital Association telling them how to inspect hospitals. This was the civil rights movement that had, in fact, basically taken over.
Our job is to inspect hospitals, write down what we saw, make it clear to the administrators what the law required, and then move on.
We have field teams in the South working with the hospital administrators to bring them into compliance.
We were going down south to desegregate the hospitals. They've been segregated for a very long time. It's overdue that they change, and now is the moment.
Our staff have been specifically instructed that they are to call the hospital administrator in advance.
We're here. We'd like to schedule a date when we can come by and talk to you and inspect the hospital to make sure that you're in compliance with Title VI.
And then, of course, they didn't find what we told them to look for because beds were switched.
We called it the DHEW Shuffle. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare at that time was the big boss. And it said shuffle beds around if they knew we were coming.
And there was a lot of switching of charts to show that they had an integrated facility. Signs were taken off doors, or pictures were hung over signs on doors that said colored, white, etc. But anyway, there was a lot of cover-up.
Federal inspectors contacted Black hospital workers, maids, and civil rights activists to get the information to beat the HEW shuffle.
You would know that Blacks were there because they was on the other end of the building behind closed doors.
Went to hit the NAACP for Alabama. And from him, I knew what to look for.
African-American women who worked as maids in the community picked up everything that was going on in the doctors' homes where they worked. In many instances, it was fired right back.
I didn't go to a single place where there wasn't a story of discrimination or deliberate exclusion, differential treatment.
Some of these white doctors who were heading segregated facilities tried to convince me in a patronizing way that the best healthcare system was one that was segregated.
One of the doctors said to me, if I admitted a nigger patient into my white cardiac ward, it would kill the white patient.
We had a meeting with the hospital administrator and the medical director, a fellow named Dr. Galloway, who I will never, ever forget. I could see Dr. Galloway's face getting red. And it got red and redder until it was really bright red. And when it really got bright red, he turned to me. I think he particularly resented me as a 22-year-old medical student. He wagged his finger. He said, boy, he said, let's get one thing straight. He said, no nigger doctor's gonna look up a white woman's ass in this hospital.
The University of Mississippi Medical Center, Dr. Robert Marsden said, I know it's slow, but I want to tell you, as a measure of our good faith, that we have our first integrated ward. Here indeed was a 4-bed male ward, 2 African Americans, a white man, and a Native American. All 4 of them in their beds, all in the same room, and all 4 of them unconscious. So they had achieved their first step in integration with 4 people in a coma.
The president got weekly updates on how many hospitals were being cleared. With only 1 month to go, almost 75% of all U.S. hospitals, but less than half of Southern hospitals, were in compliance. The July 1st deadline was looming. As inspectors pushed hospitals to meet the deadline, they faced intimidation, violence, and death threats.
There were 3 or 4 instances to where I had to get out of town in a hurry. In Natchez, Mississippi, I finished a hospital and I just turned it down. But I said, you called me up here when you know you're not in compliance with the act. And if I come back again and you're not in compliance with the act, you won't be in compliance forever. I'll do everything I can to see that you never see another federal nickel. I was leaving town and they shot my windshield out. They missed me, but they got the windshield.
We have 5,511 of the 7,654 hospitals
are now in compliance.
As time ticked down, nobody was really sure what the hell was going to happen. The whole Medicare program would blow up, potentially. And either Johnson would lose the Medicare program or he would lose the civil rights legislation that had been what he thought was his legacy.
With only 2 weeks left before Medicare was to go into effect, 79% of U.S. hospitals were now in compliance with the law, but half of Southern hospitals were still segregated.
We have some 100,000 people in Atlanta who are covered by Medicare, at least they think they're covered. But on July 1st, if in fact the hospitals are not in compliance, they'll find they won't have the benefits of Medicare.
Assuming that nothing changed, and it didn't look like anything was going to change, a large proportion of elderly beneficiaries of the Medicare program might be denied access to hospitals to receive care.
We had developed a plan that we could use public health service hospitals, VA hospitals, military hospitals.
Helicopters were put on alert so that if a patient was denied admission to a hospital, they could be flown to one of the federal military facilities and receive care.
In a final attempt to bring more hospitals into compliance before the deadline, President Johnson called hospital administrators to the White House.
Now, we know there are going to be problems. One of them arises from compliance with the laws of the land, specifically the Civil Rights Act.
He said that the government is not going to retreat. And he made it very clear to them, if they did not desegregate, they would not get any money.
He said, and I want you to know, and he's pointing his glasses at people, we ain't gonna lock the barn door after the horse has been stolen. We're gonna desegregate the hospitals. And he put his glasses on, and he went on with his talk. They sure remember Lyndon Johnson's direct, clear statement of public policy. So desegregate the hospitals, and then you'll come in the program.
Overnight, thousands of hospitals desegregated. I mean, they made the decision that they weren't going to run the risk of losing that funding.
You had some emergency procedures laid on in case you needed them. Have you had to use these?
We have had these, and actually we've not had a single call.
So the program was off very, very successfully.
Over 90% of the nation's hospitals and over 70% of Southern hospitals were cleared by the July 1st deadline. The federal government's commitment paid off. In only 3 months, they had done something that no one had managed to do before: integrate thousands of hospitals nationwide and over 1,000 hospitals in the South.
For all of those people that ended up being the volunteers, it was an amazing period. They really felt at the first time in their careers, they were really making a difference.
Johnson understood very well that the infusion of federal dollars in Medicare would be the hammer that we needed to integrate the health system. It was an insurance plan for the elderly, but it worked to open the doors to minorities.
It doesn't mean there's not tremendous systemic racism determining what hospital someone goes to or where they live or how they're treated. We shouldn't be naive. But that last step of the dignity and care at a hospital that's given to you, regardless of your race or your gender or your orientation or any other of these characteristics, that is a human right, that's an American right, and we help to achieve it by hospital desegregation.
It's so critical that we continue on this road of universal access to care, but beyond that, of trying to create the kind of environment where everybody has the opportunity to be healthy. So the world has changed, and for the better, I think.
While hospital desegregation was a significant advance, it did not erase racial discrimination from our healthcare system. The amazing work and life-saving policies recounted here are not irreversible. Today, far from over, drawing on the strength of those who came before, the struggle continues.
Power to Heal, Medicare and the Civil Rights Revolution was made possible with the help of funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, exploring the human endeavor. From the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, dedicated to strengthening America's future through education. From the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation President's Grant Fund of the Princeton Area Community Foundation. From City University of New York. And from Hunter College, the Samuel Rubin Foundation and the Yip Harburg Foundation.